My name's Henri Murison and I'm the director of the Northern Powerhouse Partnership. You need both. So if we're going to make this a fairer country, if we're going to deal with inequalities that in a city like Leeds are so difficult for us to get over and hold so many people back, we need to generate the prosperity and share that better than we do at the moment. And we also need to deal with the challenge of climate change. And many of the opportunities for businesses to help to drive decarbonisation actually create jobs. And so whether you call it levelling up or growth, whatever you want to think about, however we talk about the disparities in our country, it's not viable to say to people that they have to be taking a change in lifestyle that will hold those who are currently held back even more. We've got to demonstrate that this is a fair transition, and that means those with the broader shoulders need to be prepared to give up something, and it means those people who are currently some of the most disadvantaged need to see the opportunities of a net zero transition, not feel that it compounds the inequalities and the problems that they already face in their everyday lives. I think when it comes to infrastructure, you have to take a balanced view about the carbon intensity of the investment, and you have to compare it with the other choices you've got. So when it comes to something like HS2, one of the biggest challenges for our country is how do we get lorries off the road? Lorries are the hardest thing to decarbonise. And at the moment, our railways are full of people going places on trains as passengers. And that just means there isn't enough space to get the lorries off the road. And as we kind of go through these fuel protests, imagine, and this fuel shortage, it's like the fuel protests back from the Blair years, but you're seeing into a looking glass of what it will be like when we have scarcity of these things or when we have problems getting hold of them. And it would be much more sustainable and it would be better for the country to have more rail capacity so we could rely on rail freight a lot more. But unless you can increase capacity, unless you can build new lines, that isn't possible. So it isn't a choice between building HS2 and doing nothing. It's a choice between building HS2 and taking lorries off the road, or not building HS2 and keeping lorries off the road. And I think too often some in the environmentalist movement look at things in isolation and don't realise the consequences of what they're suggesting or they're opposing. And I think we need to have an open debate and a discussion about those issues, and that's why I think it's so good to have this event this evening where we can air some of these issues and have those debates in a way that's open, that's respectful, and that takes into account the fact that all the people talking tonight are long-standing environmentalists. I've been involved in the environmental movement my whole life. The difference is I work for business leaders and organisations across the north of England that employ a large number of people that live and work here. And so my perspective on how you achieve the environmental transition is different to an academic or to someone in civic life. And that difference of perspective doesn't make them wrong or me right, but it gives us a different perspective on that discussion, that debate. I think you have to be honest with people about the purpose of something, not just try and talk about the detail or the specifics in a way that doesn't allow people to debate those issues. So I think there is a problem that often engineers and people who are very interested in the technical elements of something are wanting to discuss in detail things that the wider public don't really need to understand. If you're going to make larger projects, if you're going to make the difficult decisions actually around decarbonisation, so whether you replace the gas in our pipes with hydrogen completely or in part, these are things that are currently being tried in parts of the country, right, in parts of the north of England. And you do have to have an open conversation with people to say, well, actually, we're going to put 25% hydrogen in your gas, right, because we want to save the planet. And you don't really have a choice about that. If we decide we're doing it in your place, in your area, then that's what you're going to get. And you have to have those conversations in a grown-up way. And I think sometimes the environmental movement has become overly associated with a number of middle-class sensibilities. So lots of environmentalists don't like nuclear power for various reasons, despite the fact that France is the country in Europe that's done the best on decarbonisation because it has a significant amount of nuclear in its mix. So I think sometimes those who are committed to tackle climate change have a number of other values and ideas which actually are not consistent with wanting to reach net zero. And they need to think about their own prejudices, right, and their own sensibilities, because this is such a difficult challenge that we're not going to necessarily have easy choices. A lot of the choices to get to net zero, not just in this country but around the world as we approach COP, can be really difficult. And no one's going to get to have everything they want. People are going to have to compromise. And I don't think the environmental movement sometimes demonstrates, particularly to working class communities or more disadvantaged parts of a city, that they're very interested in their issues or their concerns. And the problem is, unless you can get those people on board who are not evangelists, then you're not going to get the behaviour change in people's daily lives that we need to get, because it isn't just about what the state can do, what businesses can do. Many of these changes will be driven by individuals and by communities, and not just by those that are adherents to this cause. We're going to need to get the whole of a city like Leeds to believe or be committed to these issues, the whole of West Yorkshire. And that's going to require a different outlook and making different arguments that don't just appeal to the converted, but actually create new adherents. And that's something, clearly, I'm someone who's worked in communications and sort of political marketing my whole life since I left university. So I know a bit about that and I want to help. But I think sometimes those who consider themselves committed environmentalists are not very interested in what those people like me and others like me who want to help can do to support them. We want to help, but sometimes I don't think those who are committed to this cause particularly want people like us to help them. I think they want to carry on the way they are. And the challenge is, this isn't just about their views, it's about what the whole of society is going to do. And that's going to have to mean we have a broader conversation that involves people from lots of different perspectives. I think it's vital. And I think it's vital to think about a public sphere, right? So in our country, too often people want to hear opinions they already agree with. And that's not healthy in a democracy. People need to be exposed to views not that are objectionable or inappropriate in the way they're framed, but different contested points of view, particularly where the facts are able to be established, but there is an interpretation to be made on those facts. So people have a right to understand the different perspectives on a problem before they decide what side they want to be on that issue. But if they just follow people on Facebook they already agree with, if they just get their news from Twitter and only follow people they like or think they agree with, then that isn't healthy. And I think some of the debate about GB News and the approach to how almost like the idea of almost like an anti-woke news channel, I think that's potentially very damaging, because it's bad enough that we have certain newspapers or certain news sites that only really take a particular line or view on an issue or a set of issues. But I don't think we can see that in television. I think we need to see the media, particularly the broadcast media, as a place where, just like tonight, people do hear those different views. But not everybody puts on the nightly news every night, and not everybody wants to do that. So how do we find different ways to get people to engage with these big issues, these big conversations, particularly in places like Leeds that have got huge choices ahead of them? What you need to remember is that the weekend, Leeds is probably busier than it was 2 years ago, a lot of the time at the moment. So like talk of the death of cities is, I think, a bit overrated. I would say that even during the working week, there are about 70% of the same number of people already here, right? So what we're not having to do is turn back some huge tide from COVID. People are coming back and want to see each other, and people want to socialise again, and people want to be together in places like cities, but in smaller towns and communities. That's exactly what people want to do. But I think the reality of this crisis is that it's shown us that we have to, as a society, be prepared to take difficult decisions, and we have to be able to understand that sometimes the needs of other people need to be balanced against our own rights and individual freedoms. And I think those conversations are really urgent. So I think people will go back to bars and people will go back to restaurants all by themselves. They don't need something like this to bring them into the city. But I think for them to face up to the realities of what this pandemic means for our society and what we need to do next to try and make the world we live in a more sustainable and a more less fractured one, then I think we do need events like this.